Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. I am delighted to be joined today by Jacob Heilbrunn, a frequent guest on this show and a contributor to The Spectator, and another Spectator contributor, the award-winning journalist and broadcaster Dr. David Whitehouse, who wrote a very interesting piece that we published last week about Greenland and the future of warfare, really. Jacob, I'll start with you because the Greenland issue has heated up, I think it's fair to say, over the weekend. Trump has upped the ante on Europe. On Saturday, he threatened, or didn't threaten, he said he would start imposing on the 1st of February tariffs on several European nations, including the United Kingdom, of 10%, which would then go up to 25% in June if the complete and full sale of Greenland or annexation by America of Greenland was not completed. And then today, we've seen this letter that he wrote to the Danish Prime Minister saying, suggesting, perhaps comically, perhaps in a trolling way, that because he was not given the Nobel Peace Prize, he was even more adamant that America should annex Greenland. First of all, Jacob, what do you make of what's going on?
I don't think Trump is joking in his letter. I think he was incensed that he didn't receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And there is opposition mounting not only abroad, but also at home to Trump's Greenland caper. And it had not occurred to me that it would be a Republican president that would seek to dismantle NATO. He has now invited Putin to join his peace board, as well as the president of Belarus, Lukashenko. So, to borrow a word that I just learned from the Spectator's Rod Little, Trump does seem to be going a bit doolally.
Well, it's interesting what you say about NATO there, Jacob, because the Board of Peace is being established just as Trump's about to visit Switzerland. He's about to go to the World Economic Forum. And there's some speculation that there'll be some crunch meetings about Ukraine there. And Trump world has been quite frustrated, has it not, with Europe, with the UK, and with what Team Trump regards as European obstinance when it comes to Ukraine, and is much more eager to deal directly with Putin and revert to a more of a sort of great power agreement between Russia and America over the future of Ukraine and possibly Eastern Europe.
Well, Trump sees the Europeans as ungrateful mendicants and is eager to detach the United States from Europe, even though we have $2 trillion a year in trade. I think he would like to perform a pincer movement on Europe, which would be to annex Greenland, divest himself of NATO, and form some kind of alliance with Russia instead.
David, your piece was looking at partly at the Golden Dome, which Trump has said twice now. He's spoken about how, on Truth Social, he's talked about how the Golden Dome is imperative for America and the future of America's security and, indeed, he says, European allies. Why is Greenland so important for the Golden Dome?
Well, Greenland's in a very interesting position globally because it lies on the flight path between strategic nuclear missiles launched from the Kola Peninsula, where many of these are concentrated in Russia, to mainland USA. So if you want to track them, and particularly if you want to intercept them, this is a very useful place to work from. Because not only does the radar at Pufutnik base able to see these things enter the atmosphere after they've been picked up by infrared-capable satellites which detect the launch, but it gives useful time to work out their intent, their trajectory, the type of missile it actually is. So should there be any form of defensive shield, the Golden Dome, which, as you say, Trump is very enthusiastic about, and indeed the whole American aerospace company sees dollar signs and contracts with the Golden Dome. So this provides information, it provides timing, it provides enough time to assess what the threat is and to muster other tracking devices and possibly space interceptors, ground interceptors. So from a strategic position for launching ballistic missiles, Greenland is a very important area because the missiles reach their peak over Greenland, and so it's a wonderful place to track it. But not only just because of that, it's also a place where satellites naturally in polar orbit naturally concentrate their orbits. So communication-wise, it is important, and as indeed are all major Arctic communication centres. So this is an essential part of any defence for the America, Golden Dome or not.
Well, that's the key question, isn't it, David? Because the Europeans, Denmark and most European nations, seem to be quite adamant that there's some agreement can be come up with. They recognise the strategic importance. Some agreement, whether it's leasing Greenland or letting America expand its existing stations there. Some agreement can be struck, but Trump seems very adamant that America must own it outright. Why do you think he's so adamant about that?
This is somewhat confusing to me because the Pofutnik base, formerly Thule base, is an American base, but it has the Danish flag flying over it. And indeed, it's under the agreement that it is Danish territory, but the Americans have the right to put practically whatever they want there. They have to seek Danish permission, but that's a walk in the park. Denmark will say yes to anything. In fact, if America wanted to expand its bases to include sites that it used to have in the past, Denmark would say yes. So in a sense, Trump has everything he wants from Denmark, except ownership, because Denmark will allow military bases to be put there, to allow extra tracking, it will allow extra Golden Dome facilities to be put there. It will keep Russia and China away from the mineral resources in the region. And it also will provide an effective base to look at the international sea routes as the Arctic opens up. So apart from ownership and this idea that you have to own a territory to defend it, which I think he said, Trump actually has everything he could possibly want from a strategic point of view and from a commercial point of view in terms of exploiting the minerals, as it is at the moment. So this ownership seems to be an extra layer of what could be regarded as unnecessary practically, but of course symbolically and politically, it's what he wants.
And one possibility that springs up from reading your piece is that it might be the case that Russia and America, they have been in dialogue for some time now, mostly over Ukraine, but that they might be planning some sort of dividing up of the Arctic. And you mentioned in your piece Svalbard, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is in Norwegian site, and that the Russians may try to assert themselves there.
Well, Russia already has a presence on Svalbard because of the Svalbard Treaty of 1920. It was agreed that it is owned by Norway, but Russia has rights to settle there. Indeed, of I think the 21 countries who have accepted the Svalbard Treaty, all of them, New Zealand, Australia, America, Italy, Sweden, they all have the right to live there without visas and to establish infrastructure there, although military work there is restricted, or they're not completely banned. But the two main groups there are Svalbard and Russia in a separate base. And its strategic importance for communication satellites is such that Russia has to come up against the West on Svalbard because of the communications, because of the scientific data, because of the commercial data there. So they have to have a presence there. And the worry is, of course, that they would increase their presence and interfere with this communications traffic in a more subtle way than their trawlers have been just cutting, cables and information lines going across between Svalbard and Norway. So it is a nexus. I think in my piece I called it a modern day Thermopylae. It is a pinch point for communications that is essential for both East and West. And therefore, how can it not be a source of conflict with the Russians, who we know are very sneaky and very efficient at trawling for weaknesses in our cyberstructure?
Jacob, what do you think about the state of play between Russia and America at the moment as regards the Arctic? Do you think this has been part of their discussions as they talk about Ukraine and other issues?
It may well. The overall tenor of Trump's approach right now is, I have to say, pretty ominous. Richard is quite right. The Danes and the other Europeans have essentially prostrated themselves before Trump over Greenland. We have the right under the 1951 treaty to open up an additional 16 military bases. Trump has shown not a scintilla of interest in discussing this. He wants to occupy Greenland for what he called reasons of psychological necessity to the New York Times. It's 836,000 square miles that he covets. And he thinks that this will allow him to go down in history as a great president. I think the polls show that most Americans are uninterested in this. This is not an excellent adventure. And if he cozies up to Putin, the Russian media is exhorting him at this very moment to occupy Greenland, because they know that it won't change anything about the geopolitical situation in the Arctic, but it will most likely sunder the NATO alliance. So I was talking with our friend Tom Switzer from Australia last night, and he and others are calling this sort of a Suez moment. So catering to Russian sensitivities at the very moment that it is stymied in Ukraine would constitute a geopolitical disaster for the United States.
Well, Trump does like brinksmanship, and it certainly seems like he's very serious about Greenland at the moment. But of course, he is thinking about other things too, and he is travelling to Switzerland, where he will probably be talking to the Europeans about the trade deals they're striking with the Mercosur Latin American countries and with Germany and India too. Do you think that's part of the greater game here, Jacob, that Trump is increasingly angry with countries like Canada, but also the European Union, and their apparent willingness to accommodate China's agenda when it comes to trade, but not America's?
Well, no, I don't think Trump is angry. He at least feigned indifference to the Canadian trade deal with the Chinese. Look, it's inevitable. If you go around braying about America first all the time, why on earth wouldn't Canadians simply say, well, we're pursuing Canadian first? If you believe in this sovereignty, why wouldn't the Danes say, well, actually, Greenland is ours? I mean, he's creating a situation in which he thinks he can create a fortress America, Latin America, Central America, and Greenland. And they're also talking about Iceland now. So, I mean, I think he is isolating the United States. But, he's going to come into Davos, I bet, with a very bellicose and truculent speech about how he's determined to do this, how he's creating a new world order. To me, it smacks of megalomania.
David, you mentioned the satellites and the data and recognizing missiles coming in. But another reason we understand that Trump and a lot of American strategists are interested in Greenland is because of the shipping lanes and that they are becoming more open. How true is that? How easy is it now to navigate a way through Greenland or through the Arctic for countries like China and Russia if they wanted?
It's much better than it was. I mean, it's difficult to see what are natural cycles and what is the retreat of the ice due to global warming. But there are definitely major changes gone on in the 40 or so years since we've had effective satellite monitoring of the region, particularly in the northern Russian coast. And Russia has made some significant moves about wanting to control traffic across that route, because from Russia to from China actually to the European markets, to say Rotterdam, actually when the northern Russian route is open, not only due to the fact that Russia has a monopoly of icebreakers in the region, but when it is open naturally, and when a Canadian route opens up more often, it actually makes sense for China not to go through around Africa or through the Suez Canal. It is far quicker for them to go across northern Russia and then that way into northern Europe that way. Of course, that brings all sorts of political tensions because Russia regards its approach to the North Atlantic from its northern territories as being an essential part of its international defence, of its national. It regards that area as it's to monitor, and there's always been great tension between the two there. But it's certainly true that Russia is highlighting its attempts to legally and by bullying to control the northern Russian coastline. But also, as Canada opens up as well, this means that places like Greenland, and remember, Pofutnik is the most northerly military base that is a deep water port that America has access to, makes those even more important. So Greenland is as you know, we know it was a backwater for so many years, but with technology and with climate change and with modern requirements for rare earth metals and such like that, as we are all talking about, it's become a nexus for fundamental forces in the modern world.
And a nexus for China as well, because we don't normally think of China as being a sort of Arctic presence. It's quite far away, but China's navy is very large now, and they seem increasingly interested in the Arctic. Do you think that's to do with space and satellite communications and so on?
Well, the thing about China is that it's very difficult, I find, to compartmentalize what it's doing. Because when you talk about its space business, which particularly I'm interested in, its tentacles reach everywhere. It's not like, say, the United States, where you have civil space and military space and commercial space, all working against each other or together each other. With China, it's all the same. They're all interconnected. Therefore, it's wanting to dominate low Earth orbit. It's wanting to have its own communication network. It's wanting to understand how to disrupt Starlink. All this fits in with its expansion northwards towards an opening Arctic region. So it's almost like as if there is something that China has a grand plan to become the world's leading nation in 50 years' time, by the anniversary of the Great Revolution, and that it doesn't have to, like the West, go back every few years to seek an electoral mandate or have a change of government or a change of position. It just has to cope with its own economy, but it can push forward with what it wants to do. And of course, as we've said, if you're interested in space, if you're interested in communication networks, if you're interested in monitoring what's going on in the world for civil or military purposes, you have to have a major presence in the Arctic. And China's been doing this so far with communication stations on ships, on large ships. But there may come a time when they want to put it on land somewhere, and that'll be interesting as well. They decide to negotiate to put that.
Jacob, Trump obviously created Space Force in his first term. He's always been interested in it as a potential region for conflict. He's talked about the Golden Dome, as we discussed. How much do you think he's thinking about space and the future of warfare? Or do you think he's just shooting from the hip?
No, look, one of the interesting things about Trump is his ability to shake up conventional wisdom. And, he is building on Reagan's dream of a strategic defense initiative, which Reagan floated to the astonishment of his advisors in March 1983 with a national address. And we actually have made some progress in anti-missile technology, obviously, with the Patriot systems and so forth. Whether an ICBM system can really be constructed is another question. It's incredibly costly. It raises all kinds of questions about the efficacy of mutual assured destruction. So, no, I don't think Trump is shooting from the hip. I think he's very interested in it. And it is something that the United States should be pursuing as a research program. Now, whether it is necessary to annex Greenland in order to do this is entirely another question.
I confess, actually, that I'm old enough to know about Star Wars and Reagan. And I remember having to give that speech in 1983. All the space scientists phoned each other up and said, what on earth is he talking about? What is Star Wars? What is the Strategic Defense Initiative? And I did some work for them in the 1980s, and it became pretty obvious very quickly that this wasn't going to work because the technology was not up to it. Because the great idea of intercepting, monitoring, tracking, intercepting was a fine idea, but nothing worked. The technology was not there. But Trump, I think, knows now and has been told by an increasingly aggressive American aerospace industry that the technology is now available, that you can do that with the constellations of monitoring satellites. You can track, monitor, and possibly intercept things far more efficiently and far more quickly than is ever possible before, and certainly possibly to turn a Star Wars idea into some form of reality. The problem that Trump has is the problem he has with everything. He wants this done next year or the year after that, or, it's not going to happen. It's going to take a decade at least for the aerospace companies to develop the technology to test them. And they're very keen on the money and the contracts. Who of course, they're keen on government contracts. So, yes, it's possible now. And who knows what the architecture would be in the future and what, say, China's response would be to that. But for the first time, in the last few years, I think Trump's been told by the Space Force, they can do this.
Mm. Well, and as you said, the Chinese Communist Party can think in decades, unlike democratic powers. Just a technical question. I'm sorry if this is very ignorant, but if the Golden Dome needs this Pacific, am I pronouncing that right? Pacific.
But yeah, I always get this. I'd say Thule base. That's what its original base.
That base, anyway. If that base is such an important part for a Golden Dome system, presumably it doesn't actually fall under the dome itself, and any hostile power would strike the base first to knock down the system.
That's a good question, because one thing we're seeing from Russia, we were more impressed in the past than we are at the moment, was their hypersonic missiles. Because hypersonic missiles are so difficult to track. Once you set them off, they travel so fast, they get to their target so quickly, there's practically nothing you can do about it. So one way, the various ways to get round a Golden Dome is to overwhelm, underfly, or outfox. And this hypersonic missiles could take out Thule very quickly indeed, and it would be one of the first targets. So America has to understand these missiles, but it does seem, however, that from what we understand about the technology of Russian hypersonic missiles, that it's like many things in their military, it's not quite as advanced as we thought it was, and that it relies on much more cruder components. But you could say as long as it works, it works. But you're quite right. The Golden Dome would be protected of Thule, but it's not part of the main shield of America homeland. But the Golden Dome is not just one thing. It would be several layers of defense. And the way it would work is that you would try and get as much as you can on the outer layers from space-based interceptors and stuff like that. And it's only when you get closer to the homeland would you have ground-launched interceptors and something similar to the Iron Dome in Jerusalem. The objective would be to not use that as much as you can. You'd use the outer defences first, because an inner Iron Dome, if you like, is never going to get very much.
Jacob, let's talk a little bit more again about the politics of what's going on at the moment. Obviously, European powers are responding to Trump's tariff announcement at the weekend. And it seems a little bit as though, well, Keir Starmer this morning, the British Prime Minister, was a little bit more ambivalent. But the European powers, Macron and Germany, are, it's fair to say, being a bit more tough in their response. And if we go back to last year when Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, and most of the European Union and Britain took a softly approach. They tried not to escalate a trade war as quickly as possible. It seems a bit as though this time round a an aggressive trade war between Europe and America is more possible?
It seems likely because France is bucking for a fight. Macron is talking about not only aiming the bazooka, the trade bazooka at America, but actually firing it. And actually, I can't blame the Europeans. The issue is you had a trade deal that Ursula von der Leyen helped negotiate, and it was quite favorable to the United States. How do you deal with a leader who then suddenly impetuously declares, nope, it's not good enough. Here are my new terms. Now, the last time the British confronted this, it was Neville Chamberlain, who had reached deals with Hitler. And then, as Sir Neville Henderson recounts in his memoirs, failure of a mission. A week or two later, Hitler would say, shrug his shoulders and tell Chamberlain, nope, it's not good enough. I want more. And I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, but this does seem to be the mentality, which is Trump does seem to be sort of in the gangster mode. So if you capitulate and appease to Trump and try to appease him, it doesn't work. He comes back and asks you for more. So this may be what Trump wants. When people say, well, the danger of Trump annexing Greenland is that he would destroy NATO. Well, to him, that may seem like an incentive, not a deterrent. The Senate, in the last year of Biden's presidency, passed a resolution co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, which demanded that an American president would have to seek the Senate's approval to exit NATO. But Trump may have discovered a way to end the alliance through another route.
Well, he hasn't yet made, or certainly in recent weeks, he has not made any noises about leaving NATO. His line is what it has been for some time, which is, we make NATO stronger. Because of me, NATO is stronger. And he does this sort of, we'll do everything it takes, even though they criticize us and hate us, but we'll always be there.
I don't think it's quite right. In that 2.5-hour New York Times interview that he gave, they asked him directly about NATO or Greenland. And he said, well, maybe I'll have to choose. To me, that was a pretty pregnant answer. He shouldn't even be going down that road.
And Jacob, sorry, quickly, you talked about pushback. We understand some Republican pushback. What would that pushback look like, and how, if everybody on the Hill decided they wanted to stop Donald Trump, do you think they could?
Well, they could, for example, pass a War Powers Act forbidding the president from attacking Greenland without seeking the approval of Congress, which he's supposed to do anyway. There are enough opposition from Senate Republicans publicly would stop this in its tracks. However, even though Trump's approval ratings are plummeting and the prospects of the GOP for the midterms look pretty shaky, they still seem to fear Trump more than they fear the voters. And there are a variety of reasons for that. There's the media storm that he can arouse against them. And then there's the question of personal safety, because other senators have previously been physically threatened privately. So Trump wields at this moment an immense amount of power. He has also apparently activated American troops that he will potentially send into Minnesota. So I think that in a way, these foreign expeditions are of a piece with what he's trying to do domestically in the United States. He can invade Greenland and declare a crisis and then invoke the Insurrection Act in the United States as well, saying that the situation internationally and domestically is so tense that he needs to wield supreme powers to maintain order.
David, it's probably a bit simplistic to say European states must choose between whether they want to live in a China-led future or an America-led future. But there's an element of truth to it in that European powers and Canada, they need to decide whether they're willing to deal with Trump's America or come up with an agreement or some sort of future relationship with China as they look ahead to the future. Is that am I being too simplistic by putting it like that?
Well, no, I'm very much an amateur historian in terms of global factors. My interests are more scientific, but I do tend to realise that the history we have lived with in the past few decades is fairly atypical. It's been peaceful. It's been, on the whole, prosperous for many people. But these things do change over decades, over half centuries. And the world seen 50 years apart in the past and in the future, it's not going to be the world that we experience today, particularly, as you say, with China, because China has this long-term plan to become the world's leading nation. Certainly in my field, the space business, it is slowly gaining dominance as the world's leading spacefaring nation, and may well beat the Americans to put people back on the moon in a few years' time. And that's the case with all areas of its technology. It's astronomy, it's quantum communications, it's telecommunications, its own satellite systems, it's biology, it's therapeutics, it's cloning, it's pharmaceuticals. It is becoming slowly, in terms of the scientific currency of the world, the major player. And particularly when Donald Trump comes along and starts slashing budgets or starts a fight over budgets, which occupies a lot of American scientists to get the money they thought they had back. This is short-term downward squiggles while China is going further up again, and indeed also India as well. So from a scientific point of view, if I was able to come back in 25 years' time, I would expect China and India to be the major scientific partners of the world, with America, if things continue as they do, just about trying to hold its own with Europe. So it's interesting to see how these things happen. Certainly, the pivot of scientific technology process in the future is going to be AI and quantum computing, because they will reach all aspects of technology, of society. And America had Silicon Valley in the past, but it's not clear that Silicon Valley and all the expertise and the money and the foresight that they've got there is going to compete with China in the future. Very interesting times from my point of view.
That is very interesting. And Jacob, finally to you, as editor of the National Interest, I'm sure you've edited, perhaps even written, countless articles about the Thucydides trap, which is, I think, the idea that one superpower cannot overtake another superpower without a war. It does feel a little bit, without wanting to sound panicky, that we are reaching potentially a crunch stage in that process.
Well, after having delivered so many depressing verdicts, I want to try and end on a more optimistic note, which is that none of this is inevitable. It's possible that Trump will pull back in the next weeks. And China, I regard with a measure of skepticism. There is a report today that its demographic crisis is worsening. I think its birth rate is down to something of the worst since 1949. Its housing sector is vastly inflated. So I'm a little wary of concluding that the United States is headed for the dustbin of history and China's march ahead is inevitable. It may be that we have become complacent, as Richard points out. We've become used to peace and freedom and economic prosperity. And a certain decadence has crept in, which I think Trump manifests. However, he is almost 80 years old, a product of the baby boom generation that has had a quite negative effect on America in the recent decades. So the U.S. could turn around and China remains an open question. I still believe that the United States, which is a democracy, has more going for it than does China. And to end, I'll just quote Bismarck, who said that God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States.
Well, we should end on that. I was going to push back. I might push back a little bit, actually, Jacob. Just say, there are a lot of people who'd say Trump, far from being the manifestation of the decadence, is the first leader in a long time to actually try and reverse it. He's pushing back on China's incursions in Latin America. He's taking seriously the problems of Arctic security and so on.
There's no question that the goals that Trump has in mind are not are good ones. I mean, he has taken the China threat seriously. Greenland is important. China was making encroachments into Central and South America. Fine. But the way to counter that is to build up your alliances, not to willfully act like a predator and seek short-term gain, as Richard was saying, rather than looking at the long-term strategic benefits of what's actually in the American national interest. Trump, for example, in setting up a secret account in Qatar where he's putting these Venezuelan oil monies, look, it all has the appearance of a personal grift as opposed to what is in the United States' interest.
Jacob and David, will leave it there, but thank you very much for coming on to Americano.